The morning Catherine Hawthorne burned her hand on the cast iron skillet, she pressed her lips together, wrapped a strip of torn petticoat around her palm, and went right back to work without making a single sound, because that was simply the kind of woman she was. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of everything and the beginning of nothing, a place where the wind carried red dust through the streets, and the sun laid itself flat and merciless across the plains like a judgment no one had asked for. Caldwell was a cattle town, positioned just north of the Kansas Indian Territory border, and it breathed the particular kind of life that cattle towns breathed: restless, loud, smelling of horse and leather and dried grass, alive with the clatter of boots on wooden boardwalks and the distant low complaint of longhorns waiting in the holding pens south of town. Catherine had come to Caldwell 2 years prior, in the late summer of 1876, following her husband Robert Hawthorne, who had believed with every bone in his body that the cattle trade would make them rich. Robert had been a lean, hopeful man with a good laugh and a habit of dreaming wider than his arms could reach. He had put nearly everything they had into a small parcel of land 3 miles east of town, 40 acres of short-grass prairie with a creek running along the southern edge, and he had started with 12 cattle and the absolute conviction that 12 would become 100 and 200 and 1,000. Robert had been dead 14 months. A fever had taken him in the January of 1877, a brutal hard January when the temperature dropped below what thermometers in Caldwell were equipped to measure, and Catherine had sat beside him through 4 nights and watched the man she loved disappear from the inside out. She had not wept in front of anyone. She had cried exactly once, alone in the barn with her forehead pressed against the warm flank of her mare, Pearl, on the morning they lowered Robert into the frozen ground. After that, she had composed herself and gotten on with the business of surviving. Surviving, as it turned out, was expensive. By the spring of 1878, Catherine was 26 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with dark brown hair that she kept pinned severely at the back of her neck and gray eyes that most people in Caldwell had never seen soften. She was considered capable by the men of the town and intimidating by most of the women, and she suited both descriptions just fine. She had managed to keep the 40 acres. She had 6 cattle left. The others had died in the same brutal winter that had taken Robert, or been sold off to cover debts that had mounted with the particular cruelty that debts reserve for widows in hard country. She had 3 chickens, a kitchen garden that was only now beginning to push green shoots up through the soil, a mortgage held by the Caldwell Savings and Loan, and a pride that was so deeply embedded in her it had become indistinguishable from her skeleton. She did not ask for help. She had never asked for help. She would sooner have eaten the 40 acres one shovelful at a time than admitted to anyone in Caldwell that she was struggling to hold everything together with her bare and often blistered hands. The morning she burned herself on the skillet was a Tuesday, and she had already been up since 4 o'clock, having spent the previous 3 hours mending harness leather by lamplight because the harness needed mending, and there was no one else to do it, and she could not afford to pay John Haverstock at the saddle shop his regular rate. The burn was not serious, she had encountered worse, but her hands were already so raw from the harness work, and the cold well water, and the daily labor of keeping 40 acres functional with only herself as labor that the additional insult of the burn made the whole hand throb with a deep, insistent ache that radiated up to her wrist. She bound it. She went on. That was simply what Catherine Hawthorne did. Lewis Warren had arrived in Caldwell 3 weeks earlier, in the first week of April, riding in from the south on a big gray horse named August, with a bedroll and a worn canvas bag, and a reputation that had preceded him by exactly no one, because Lewis Warren was not the kind of man who generated reputation. He was 29 years old, of middling height with broad shoulders and hands that were thick and capable in the particular way of men who had spent their whole adult lives working with them. He had a face that was not precisely handsome, but was deeply honest, square-jawed, sun-browned, with pale blue eyes that had a quality of noticing things that most people assumed he had missed entirely. He had grown up in Missouri, crossed into Kansas at 22, and spent the intervening 7 years working cattle drives along the Kishom Trail, the great cattle highway that ran north from Texas through the Indian Territory and into Kansas, passing through Caldwell at its northern end. He knew cattle the way other men knew Scripture, intimately and practically, and he had saved enough from 7 years of trail wages to want something of his own. He was not a complicated man in the way that men who make things complicated wish to appear. He was a quiet man, but the quiet was not emptiness. It was the quiet of someone paying close attention. He had taken a room at Ma Epler's boarding house on Main Street and presented himself to Clarence Dodd, who ran the largest cattle operation north of town, looking for work. Dodd had hired him on the spot, because men who knew the Kishom Trail as Lewis Warren knew it were not common, and because Dodd was expanding his operation and needed competent hands badly enough to pay for them without quibbling about rates. Lewis had been working for Clarence Dodd for exactly 12 days when he first saw Catherine Hawthorne. She was driving a wagon into town from the East Road, sitting upright on the bench with the reins held in both hands and her chin lifted, and her eyes fixed ahead with the focused, forward-looking expression of someone who has no time for peripheral distractions. The wagon was loaded with dried and salted beef she was bringing to the dry goods store owned by Harold Beam, where she had a standing arrangement to supply him in exchange for credit against flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities she could not produce herself. Lewis was crossing the main street when the wagon rolled past, and he stepped back to let it go, and he noticed 3 things about Catherine Hawthorne in the 3 seconds it took her wagon to pass him. He noticed that the left rear wheel of the wagon had a developing crack in its spoke that, if she drove back over the rutted East Road without addressing it, had a reasonable chance of failing on her. He noticed that her right hand on the rein was wrapped in a piece of cloth that had once been white, and was now the brownish-pink color of a wound that had wept blood into its bandage and dried there. He noticed that she held the reins with her left hand, doing most of the work subtly in the way of someone compensating for pain without admitting to compensation. He noted all of this. He said nothing. He did not know her, but he thought about the wagon wheel. That afternoon, after he had finished his work at the Dodd operation and ridden back into town, Lewis went to see Hector Morales, who ran the livery and also did the closest thing to wagon repair that Caldwell offered, and he described the crack in the spoke with enough precision that Hector understood immediately which wagon he meant and what needed doing. "That's the Hawthorne widow's wagon," Hector said, leaning against the stable door with a knowing expression. "She won't want you touching it." "I'm not going to ask her," Lewis said. Hector studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has decided that someone else's business is not his problem. "She usually leaves it out front of Beam's for a few hours while she tends to her account and collects her order. I can look at it then. What do you need from me?" "Nothing," Hector said. "I know what a cracked spoke looks like." Lewis paid Hector's fee in advance, which Hector accepted without further commentary, and the matter was concluded. Catherine Hawthorne never knew her wheel had been fixed. She drove home that evening on the East Road, and when she arrived at her homestead and climbed down from the bench, she had no idea that the repair had been done or that a man she had never spoken to had been responsible for it. She noticed only that her hand was throbbing badly enough that she had to grip the fence post with her good hand to keep her balance when she stepped down, and she stood there for a moment, very still, with the late April sun sinking red and enormous at the western edge of her 40 acres, and she breathed through the pain until it retreated to a level she could manage. Then she fed the cattle, fed the chickens, cooked a small supper, and went asleep. Lewis Warren's first direct encounter with Catherine Hawthorne came 4 days later, on a Saturday morning, in the Caldwell Savings and Loan, which was a narrow building on the south side of Main Street with a wooden floor that needed replacing, and a teller's window behind which a prissy, precise young man named Arthur Finch worked with the air of someone who believed that his position gave him authority over the destinies of ordinary people. Catherine was standing at the teller's window when Lewis came in. He had come to open a modest account with his Dodd wages, an unremarkable transaction, but he paused near the door when he saw her, because something about the set of her shoulders told him that whatever was happening at that window was not going the way she wanted. She was speaking in a low, controlled voice that was doing everything it could to remain pleasant and failing at the outermost edges, where a very faint tightness had crept in. Arthur Finch was looking down at a ledger and explaining something with the particular combination of regret and satisfaction that people deploy when they are delivering bad news that secretly pleases them. Lewis could not hear the specifics. He understood the broad shape of it, the mortgage, the payment date, the gap between what she had and what the payment required. He moved to the small bench along the wall and sat down and took off his hat and turned it in his hands, which was something he did when he was thinking about something he was not yet certain about. Catherine concluded her conversation at the window with a polite, very final "I understand, Mr. Finch," and turned from the counter. She saw Lewis then, sitting on the bench. He had his hat in his hands and was looking at the floor, as if he had not been listening at all, as if he had simply arrived after her and was waiting his turn. She gave him the kind of brief, impersonal nod that one townsperson gives another and walked out through the door. Lewis watched her go. He went to the counter and opened his account. He said nothing to Arthur Finch about Catherine Hawthorne. It was not Finch's business what Lewis was thinking, and Lewis had not yet decided what he was going to do or if he was going to do anything. The trouble was, he kept noticing things. A week passed. On the Monday of the second week, Lewis finished early at the Dodd operation. A fence line had been repaired faster than anticipated, and Dodd, who was a fair man in his own rough way, told his hands they were free until the following morning. Lewis rode east on the main trail, not with any particular plan, only because east was where the wind was clearest that afternoon, and he liked to ride when he had time and nowhere specific to be. He found Catherine Hawthorne on the road about a mile from her property, standing beside Pearl the mare, and looking at something in the horse's left foreleg with an expression of controlled and absolute despair that she was working very hard to make look like simple concentration. Pearl had a stone wedged in her hoof and had gone lame on the road, which was an inconvenient problem at the best of times, and at this particular moment, with the full weight of everything else Catherine was carrying, was apparently the thing that had stripped her carefully maintained composure down to its frame. Lewis pulled August to a stop on the road beside her. She straightened immediately, composing her face back into its habitual lines of capable calm so quickly that a less attentive person would have thought she had always been standing that way. "Evening," Lewis said. He had a low, easy voice that carried no particular urgency. "Evening," Catherine said. She did not ask for help. Lewis swung down from August and looped his reins over the saddle horn. He crouched beside Pearl without asking permission and ran his hand down the mare's leg with the practiced ease of a man who has gentled 100 horses. And Pearl, who was usually particular about strangers, let him, because horses tend to trust people who approach them honestly. He found the stone, worked it free carefully with his thumb, and stood up. Catherine was watching him with an expression that was complicated in a way she was trying very hard to make uncomplicated. "Thank you," she said. The words were brief and correct and offered nothing further. "She'll be fine," Lewis said. "Tender for a bit, maybe." He did not say anything that could be construed as commentary on the fact that she had been standing in the middle of the East Road with a lame horse and no clear way of addressing the problem except to wait for something to change. He simply remounted August. "I'm Lewis Warren," he said from the saddle. I work out at the Dodd operation. I know who you are, Catherine said, not unkindly but not warmly. Matter of fact. Catherine Hawthorne, he said, not a question. That's right. She was already looking back at Pearl, checking the hoof. Lewis touched the brim of his hat and rode on. He did not look back. Catherine stood on the road for a moment after he had gone, looking at the space where he had been. She was not sure what she felt about Lewis Warren. He had not made a production of helping her, had not waited for her to thank him elaborately, had not assumed any intimacy from the fact of it. He had simply done what needed doing and gone. She was not sure if that made her feel better or worse. She led Pearl home carefully, checking the mare's gait, and thought about nothing in particular, which was her way of thinking about something quite specific without having to acknowledge it directly. Over the following 2 weeks, Lewis Warren began to do things. He did not announce them. He did not present them as gifts or favors or charity or anything that would require Catherine Hawthorne to receive them as such, because he had understood in those 3 brief seconds watching her wagon roll past him on Main Street that receiving help was not something Catherine did gracefully, and doing it visibly would make her refuse it. So he was quiet about it, in the way he was quiet about most things. He spoke to Hector Morales again, who mentioned in passing to 2 men who worked odd jobs around the eastern properties that the fence line on the Hawthorne 40 needed attention on its north side. Both of those men happened to need a few dollars and happened to do the work one morning when Catherine was in town, and when she came home, the north fence was tight where it had been sagging, and she had no way to determine who had done it or why. She assumed it had been the wind, which was the explanation that made least logical sense, but was also the only one she could accept without having to feel grateful. Lewis did not send those men. Not exactly. He mentioned it to Hector in the way that you mention something when you are hoping the right people are listening, and then he paid for the nails and the wire from his own wages without drawing attention to the transaction. He also, and this was the thing that required the most care, started buying dried beef from Harold Beam's store with a regularity that was perhaps more than a single man strictly needed, which had the indirect effect of Harold placing a larger standing order with Catherine for the following month, which meant her credit at the store was extended without anyone telling her that the economics of her supply arrangement had just been quietly subsidized. He was careful. He was extremely careful. Because the whole point was that she must not know, or if she suspected, she must have no way to confirm it, because the moment she could confirm it, her pride would make her angry, and the anger would make her refuse everything, and then she would be back to where she had been, which was not a place he could leave her without feeling it press against him in the middle of the night when he was trying to sleep in his room at Ma Epler's boarding house. The question he had not yet answered for himself was why he cared. He examined this question in the quiet way he examined most questions, turning it over, looking at it from different angles. He had met women in his years on the trail. He was not inexperienced with the world or with the pull that particular people exert on you when you are paying attention. But there was something about Catherine Hawthorne specifically, the combination of the throbbing hand held with precise dignity on those reins, and the way she had straightened so fast when he rode up on the road, and the absolutely minimal, perfectly genuine, "thank you," she had offered that had gotten into him in a way he could not talk himself out of. She was not performing anything. She was not pretending to be fine in the theatrical way of someone who wants to be caught not being fine. She genuinely believed that being fine was her responsibility, that her struggles were hers alone, and had no claim on anyone else's time or concern. It was a kind of loneliness so profound and so self-imposed that it had become indistinguishable from strength, and Lewis Warren, who had been lonely in his own different ways for the better part of a decade, recognized it the way you recognize a language you learned in childhood. The first real conversation happened in early May. There was a town gathering on the first Saturday. These were common in Caldwell, partly social and partly practical, a chance for people to exchange information about cattle prices and weather patterns and the movements of the various outlaw elements that made the territory south of town periodically interesting. Dodd had told his hands to attend, partly because he liked to see what sentiment was running in the town, and partly because he wanted to present a sociable face. Lewis went because it was simpler to go than to explain why he preferred not to. Catherine was there because Harold Beam had told her, with the particular stubbornness of a man who means well without quite understanding what he means well about, that she needed to get out of that homestead and be among people more. She had come. She had stood on the edge of the gathering with a cup of coffee she was not drinking, and she had looked at the middle distance with an expression that said she was calculating how much longer she needed to stay to qualify as having attended before she could go home without being rude about it. Lewis got a cup of coffee from the table and crossed the room and stood next to her. He did not say anything immediately. He just stood there, looking at the same general middle distance she was looking at, as if they were two people who had independently arrived at the conclusion that this particular corner of the room was the most sensible place to be. After a comfortable silence, he said, "Cattle prices are going to be better than people think by August." Catherine looked at him. "What makes you say that?" "Trail reports from Texas. The volume coming up this season is lower than usual because of the drought conditions in the South. Lower supply, same demand." He took a sip of his coffee. "If you're looking to sell in the fall, you might want to wait until August rather than July." She was quiet for a moment, thinking about this. She had 6 cattle. The difference between a July sale and an August sale, if his analysis was correct, could be meaningful to her situation. It was also practical, useful information delivered with no fanfare and no accompanying suggestion that she needed advice, which meant she could receive it and think about it without feeling managed. "You know the trail well," she said. 7 years, he said. "Missouri," he looked at her. "How did you know that?" "The way you talk," she said. Not the accent specifically, but something in the phrasing, the mild, unhurried quality of Missouri speech that was distinct from Texas drawl and Kansas flatness. "My mother was from St. Louis. My family was outside Jefferson City," he said, "a long time ago." They were both quiet again, but it was a different quiet from before, less the quiet of two strangers maintaining polite distance and more the quiet of two people who have just exchanged something small but real. "How long has your operation been running?" he asked. 2 years, she said, "since my husband and I came out." He did not say he was sorry for her loss because everyone said they were sorry and it had long since stopped meaning anything. He said, "The land east of town is good land. The creek, along the south edge," she said, "that's a good position for summer water. Most of the east parcels dry up." He said it without emphasis, but what he was really saying was that she had something valuable, that the situation was not hopeless, that there were assets in her position that were worth noting. He did it without pointing at it directly. She looked at him for a long moment. He was looking at the middle of the room again, finishing his coffee with the uncomplicated air of a man who has said what he wanted to say and has no attachment to what happens next. "Lewis Warren," she said, as if she were filing the name in a more reliable location. "Catherine Hawthorne," he said, which he knew was her name, had always known was her name, but offered it back to her like a greeting, like a beginning. She almost smiled. It was a very small thing, barely a softening of the corners of her mouth, but it was there, and Lewis Warren noticed it, because he noticed everything about Catherine Hawthorne with a completeness that he was beginning to accept was not going to diminish with time. She left the gathering shortly after, as she had planned to. But she thought about the August sale for the entire ride home, and she felt, without quite being able to explain why, slightly less alone than she had when she left. May opened up warm and clear, which in Kansas was always a provisional gift. Warmth and clear skies were what you got before the storms arrived. Catherine threw herself into the work of the season with the focused intensity she brought to everything, and the kitchen garden began to fill in nicely, and the 6 cattle were grazing on the spring grass with the contented focus of animals that had made it through winter and intended to demonstrate the fact. She saw Lewis Warren twice more that week. Once on the road, where they exchanged a nod from opposite sides and kept going. Once at Beam's store, where they were both at the counter at the same time, and she asked his opinion on whether the feed prices were likely to hold, and he gave it to her straight, without inflation or decoration, and she appreciated that. Most men in Caldwell, when a woman asked them a practical question, answered as if they were translating from a foreign language, as if the question required them to simplify and clarify things that were perfectly obvious. Lewis just answered. He gave her the same information he would give any man he respected, and she noticed that too. On the Thursday of that second week in May, Catherine came out to the barn in the early morning to find that one of her cattle had a leg wound, a gash from where the animal had gotten into the barbed wire fencing along the east edge of the property, which had a section that had needed fixing for weeks and which she had been postponing because there were only so many hours in a day. The wound was not life-threatening if treated properly, but treatment required supplies she was low on and knowledge she was less confident about than she liked to admit, because Robert had handled the doctoring of the animals, and while she had learned a great deal by watching, she had not done it alone. She cleaned the wound as best she could. She sent the cut that the wire had made back in her mind to the section of fence she had meant to fix and tallied it against the list of things she was behind on, and the total came out to a number that made her stand very still in the barn doorway with her arms at her sides and breathe very slowly for approximately 30 seconds. She fixed the fence that afternoon. She worked until her palms were raw and the healed burn had re-aggravated itself against the wire, and the sun had gone to the color of a bruise at the horizon. She got the fence tight and she went inside, and she did not think about the mortgage payment that was 35 days away and the difference between what she had and what it required, because there was no utility in thinking about it right now, and she was too tired to solve it tonight. She would figure it out. She always figured it out. Lewis Warren, riding his evening circuit back from the Dodd operation, passed the East Road and saw the lights still burning in Catherine Hawthorne's homestead at a time when most of the surrounding properties had gone dark. He did not stop. He rode on, but he was doing arithmetic in his head. He had been doing this arithmetic for 2 weeks, careful, quiet arithmetic about what Catherine's situation likely looked like, based on what he knew of the land, the cattle count, the timing of the seasons, the mortgage rates at Caldwell Savings and Loan, which Arthur Finch had been only too happy to discuss in the abstract when Lewis had expressed the vague and entirely fictional possibility that he himself might be in the market for a land loan. He had cross-referenced Finch's information with what he knew from years on the trail about what land east of Caldwell was actually worth versus what the bank held it at. The gap between what Catherine had and what her June payment required was not catastrophic. It was the kind of gap that, if you knew where to look and had the right resources and positioned things correctly, could be addressed without anyone having to admit that anything had been addressed. The complication was that he would have to talk to her directly for this one. He had been thinking about that. He thought about it on the ride home to Ma Epler's boarding house, and he thought about it over the supper misses Epler put in front of him, and he thought about it while he cleaned his saddle in the small shed behind the house that she allowed her boarders to use for equipment, and somewhere in the middle of oiling the left stirrup strap. He decided that the talking to her directly part was going to require him to admit, at least to himself if no one else, that his interest in Catherine Hawthorne had crossed some line from simple human decency into something considerably more complicated. He cleaned the rest of the saddle with this knowledge sitting in his chest like a coal that had not yet decided whether it intended to warm him or burn him. On the following Saturday, he rode out to her property. He had thought about what he would say. He had a reason, a practical one, that was not dishonest. Clarence Dodd was looking to purchase grazing rights from adjacent landowners for the summer, and the Hawthorne parcel's creek access made it potentially interesting to Dodd, and Lewis had offered to survey the surrounding properties for him, which was true, and which meant that arriving at the Hawthorne farm was legitimately part of his work. He tied August to the fence post and went to the door and knocked. Catherine answered with her hair partially down and flour on her hands, which meant she had been baking, and she looked at him with the brief, assessing look she gave all arrivals and said, "Mr. Warren." "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "I'm sorry to call without notice. I'm working on a survey for Clarence Dodd. He's looking at grazing rights on the east parcels for the summer. I was wondering if you'd have time to walk the property line with me." She considered this for exactly 1 second. "Come in," she said. "I'll wash my hands." He waited in the small front room, which had the particular quality of a room that has been kept extremely clean through significant effort and not by any excess of resources. The furniture was spare and practical. There was a braided rug in front of the hearth that had been mended in 2 places. There was a photograph on the mantelpiece. A young couple, newly married by the look of the formality, and Lewis looked at it for a moment and looked away. Catherine came back with clean hands and her hair pinned, and she took her hat from the hook by the door and they went out. They walked the property line, which took the better part of an hour, and Lewis did his actual work, noting the creek access, the quality of the grass, the condition of the fencing, and Catherine walked beside him and answered his questions about the water levels and the seasonal patterns and the grazing behavior of the cattle, and the conversation was practical and direct and very comfortable, in the way that conversations between 2 people who share a language are comfortable without either person necessarily remarking on it. At the southwest corner of the property, where the creek bent and the grass was thickest, Lewis stopped and looked at the water and said, without preamble, Dodd would pay a fair rate for summer grazing access on this section. The creek is the best I've seen on the east properties. "How fair?" Catherine asked. He named the figure. She was quiet. "That's considerably more than I expected," she said. Her voice was very steady. "It's what the access is worth," Lewis said. "Dodd knows it. He won't argue the rate." Catherine looked at the creek for a long moment. The late morning sun was coming down through the cottonwood trees along the bank and laying yellow and white light across the water, and in that light, Lewis Warren saw something happen on Catherine Hawthorne's face that he suspected almost no one in Caldwell had ever seen. A very brief, very complete relaxing of the tension she carried. A few seconds in which the arithmetic she had been doing in her head for 14 months came out to a number that did not require everything from her simultaneously. It was gone almost immediately. She reassembled herself in the way she always did, smooth and precise, but he had seen it. "I would be amenable to that arrangement," she said. "I'll bring the papers out on Monday," Lewis said. They walked back toward the house. At the fence where August was tied, Catherine stopped and looked at him with a directness that was somehow different from her usual directness, sharper and softer at the same time. "Mr. Warren," she said, "the wheel on my wagon was repaired last month. Harold Beam increased my order without explanation. The north fence was fixed by men I didn't hire." She paused. Her gray eyes were entirely level. "And now Dodd is interested in my creek access, which you have mentioned at exactly the right moment." Lewis looked at her. He did not look away, and he did not offer an explanation, and he did not deny anything. "I'm not a charity case," she said. "No," he said, "you're not." "Then I would like to know why." He took his hat off, which he did when he was being completely honest. "Because I watched you drive that wagon into town with a burned hand, and I saw what was happening, and I could not do something about it," he said. "I didn't want you to feel managed. I didn't want you to feel like you owed anyone anything. I just wanted things to be a little less hard." The silence that followed was the longest silence they had shared. A meadowlark was singing somewhere along the creek, the sweet 3-note phrase repeating itself over and over with the patient certainty of a creature that has nothing to prove. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. And what she was really asking was something more specific, something she did not quite have the vocabulary for yet, or perhaps had the vocabulary for and was not yet willing to use. "I haven't figured out all the way why," Lewis said honestly. "But it does." Catherine looked at him for another moment, and something in her face changed, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical softening that stories about women usually require, but genuinely. A small, real change, like a door that has been locked a long time being unlocked, not swung open, just unlocked. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "You're welcome," he said. And then, carefully, because he was not a man who pushed things, "I meant what I said about the August sale. If you want to talk through the numbers before then, I'm available." "I might take you up on that," she said. He put his hat back on and swung up onto August and rode back toward the Dodd operation. And Catherine Hawthorne stood at her fence and watched him go and felt something she had not let herself feel in 14 months. The tentative, fragile, terrifying beginnings of trust. The grazing rights arrangement was formalized on the Monday as promised, and the payment that Dodd made for summer access covered the June mortgage entirely, with a remainder that Catherine put against the following month's account at Beams. She stood at the bank window, with Arthur Finch's particular brand of regretful satisfaction entirely absent from the transaction for once, and made the payment in full, and she walked out of the Caldwell Savings and Loan and stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the bright May sunlight, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for so long she had forgotten it was there. She and Lewis began to talk more regularly after that. Not in any formal or arranged way. Caldwell was a small enough town that their paths crossed naturally and frequently, and conversation grew up in those crossings, the way grass grows up in good soil when the weather cooperates. They talked about cattle prices and weather patterns and the political situation in the territory south of town, and the mechanics of kitchen gardens in Kansas clay, and the best way to treat a horse wound, and the relative merits of different barrel stove designs for winter heating efficiency. And slowly, underneath all of this practical talk, they talked about other things. He told her about Missouri. Not all of it. There were parts of that story that were still waiting to be told, but the landscape of it, the green rolling hills so different from the flat immensity of Kansas, the family farm and his father who had died when Lewis was 19, and his mother who had sold the farm and gone to live with his sister in St. Louis, and how he had come west because staying felt like treading water in a place that had stopped recognizing him. She told him about Robert. Not the death specifically, not yet, but the life before it, the way Robert had dreamed, the quality of his optimism, which had been genuine and not careless, the way they had stood together on this 40 acres the first day they owned it, and looked at what they had bought with everything they had and both been terrified and both pretended to be only excited. "Were you happy here?" Lewis asked one evening. They were sitting on the fence at the south edge of the property watching the cattle in the last of the daylight, which was something they had begun doing occasionally on Lewis's way back from the Dodd operation, a stop that had started as a brief errand and had gradually extended by mutual unacknowledged agreement into something that could be described as visits. "Yes," Catherine said. "We were happy." She was quiet for a moment. "He didn't deserve to die young. He was a good man." "I believe that," Lewis said. He meant it. He was not competing with a dead man, had no interest in doing so. Robert Hawthorne had been real and had mattered and had been loved, and Lewis respected that completely. He would have been terrible at the mortgage, though, Catherine said, with a sudden dry humor that surprised both of them. "He always believed things would work out on their own. I was the one who worried about numbers." "That's a useful combination," Lewis said. "If you have time." She looked at him. "We didn't have enough time." "No," he said. He did not add anything. They sat on the fence in the warm May evening, and the cattle grazed, and the light went from gold to copper to the faint luminescent blue that precedes dark on the Kansas plains, and neither of them spoke for a while, but it was the kind of silence that is itself a kind of saying. In the third week of May, a complication arrived in the form of a man named Dale Prout. Prout was a land speculator who had been working the eastern Kansas territory for 2 years, buying up parcels from struggling homesteaders at rates considerably below what the land was worth, and reselling them to larger operations. He was not a villain in the theatrical sense. He did not brandish weapons or make crude threats, but he was a man who had developed a precise eye for vulnerability and a smooth manner of presenting himself as the only reasonable option when a situation had been allowed to become sufficiently desperate. He arrived at Catherine's property on a Wednesday morning and introduced himself with impeccable manners and a suit that was more sophisticated than anything Caldwell usually produced, and he offered her 60% of what her land was worth in exchange for, as he put it, the relief of her obligations and the freedom to start fresh somewhere less demanding. Catherine listened to him with the same level gray gaze she brought to everything, and when he had finished, she said, "The land is not for sale." Prout smiled in the way of a man who has heard this many times and knows it is usually not the final answer. "Of course not," he said. "I'm simply making you aware of the option. Times are hard." "Good day, Mr. Prout," she said. He left. He would be back, she knew this. Men like Prout operated on the principle of erosion. That afternoon, she mentioned the visit to Lewis. They were at Beams at the same time, and she told him about it matter-of-factly, not as a cry for help, but as information she thought was relevant, because she had come to understand that Lewis Warren's practical knowledge was something she could reference without feeling diminished by using it. Lewis's expression did not change much, but something behind his pale blue eyes went very still. "How many times has he been around the East properties?" "This was the first time he came to me," she said. "I heard he's been to the Brant parcel and the Callaway place." "The Callaways sold last month." Lewis was quiet for a moment. "The Dodd arrangement helps," he said. "But it doesn't cover the full picture." "I know," she said. "There's a solution," he said carefully. "I've been thinking about it. Dodd isn't the only large operation looking for creek access and summer grazing on the East parcels. There's also the Minter brothers who run out of the territory north. If you approached them with a competing proposal, the rates would go up." She looked at him. "You know the Minter operation. I've met the older brother, Thomas, on the trail. He's a fair man and he's looking to expand his summer range. If I wrote you an introduction, he'd receive you." She was quiet for a moment. The store was quiet around them, Harold Beam having retreated to the back room with the tact of a man who understood when conversations needed privacy. "That would put me in a considerably stronger position," she said. "That's the idea," Lewis said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Lewis," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name directly. He waited. "Why are you doing this?" She was asking again, but this time it was different from the first time. This time she was not asking out of suspicion or challenge. She was asking because she genuinely wanted to know, because the answer mattered to her in a way she was beginning to accept that it mattered. "Because I would like you to keep your land," he said. "And because," he stopped, he was being careful, "because I think you're one of the most capable people I've met out here and I would like to know you for a long time." The sentence hung in the air between them, simple and complete. Catherine's gray eyes were very still. "Is that so?" she said. "Yes," he said. She nodded once slowly, as if she were filing this information in the most reliable location she had. "I'll take the introduction," she said. "Thank you." They parted at the door. Lewis rode back toward the Dodd operation and felt the coal in his chest shift from warmth to something more active, and he let it, because there was no longer any useful purpose in pretending it wasn't there. The introduction to Thomas Minter produced exactly the result Lewis had predicted. Minter arrived in Caldwell the following week to look at the Hawthorne parcel and offered a summer rate for a combined arrangement, grazing and water rights on the creek section. That, combined with the Dodd arrangement for the northern pasture, put Catherine's summer income at a level she had not seen since before Robert died. She came to tell Lewis on a Tuesday evening, riding Pearl at a pace that was slightly faster than her usual careful trot, and when she reached the Dodd operation where he was finishing up, she swung down from the mare with a lightness she had not carried in a long time and said, "Minter agreed." Lewis smiled. It was a slow, genuine smile that changed his entire face, and Catherine saw it and felt something in her chest respond to it in a way that she chose not to examine too closely for approximately 3 more days. "Good," he said. "More than good," she said. "Louis, this changes everything." "Not everything," he said, "but enough." She looked at him, and the smile that she had been keeping at bay for weeks finally arrived on her face fully and without reservation. And it was a remarkable thing, that smile, because it was Catherine Hawthorne's actual smile, not the brief, polite curve she deployed in social situations, but the real one, which involved her whole face and included a slight brightness in the gray eyes that made them something other than gray. More like the particular silvery color of the sky just before rain when the light comes through at an angle. Louis Warren looked at her smiling and thought, quietly and with complete clarity, that he was in serious trouble. The storm came in the first week of June, as Kansas storms do, suddenly, with great commitment, and with no interest whatsoever in the plans of the people underneath them. A line of weather moved in from the southwest on a Tuesday afternoon, and by evening the sky was the color of a bruise and the wind was running hard from the south, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in 3 hours. Catherine had gotten the cattle into the barn and was closing the last gate when Louis arrived on August at a canter, leaning slightly into the wind. "I saw the sky from the Dodd Road," he said, swinging down. "Do you need hands?" "I've got the cattle in," she said. "The chicken coop, the east wall, has been loose." He went directly to the chicken coop without further instruction, assessed the east wall, found the loose boards, and had them braced within 15 minutes using materials from her woodpile and a hammer from the tool chest in the barn, while the wind worked itself into a full howl, and the first rain came in sideways. Catherine held the lantern and handed him nails from the tin, and they worked without unnecessary conversation because there wasn't time for it. And when the wall was secure, they went to the barn to wait out the worst of it. The barn was warm with the closeness of the cattle and the dry, sweet smell of hay, and the storm shouted itself out against the roof and walls with tremendous theater, lightning coming in blue-white flashes through the gaps in the boards. Catherine was sitting on a hay bale with Pearl's lead rope in her hand, keeping the mare calm, and Louis was across the barn, doing the same for August, who was a more phlegmatic animal and needed less management but benefited from the company. They sat in the storm noise and the lantern light, and in the intervals between the loudest gusts, they talked. She told him about the winter Robert died, the specific details she had not told anyone. The 4 nights, the cold, the way she had held his hand through the last one and talked to him even after she was not sure he was hearing her, because it seemed important to go on talking. She told it simply, without the weight of performance, just the plain facts of it, and Louis listened in the plain, full way he had of listening to things that mattered. "What did you talk to him about?" Louis asked. "I told him about the spring," she said. "What the property would look like when the grass came back. I told him about the kitchen garden I was going to plant and what I was going to put in it. I told him that the creek was going to be beautiful in June." She was quiet for a moment. "I was describing things that were true and that he was going to miss, and I knew it and I couldn't stop." Louis was quiet for a while. The storm moved its great weight across the roof. "You've kept his promise," Louis said then quietly. "Everything he came here to build, you've kept it going." Catherine looked at him across the lantern-lit barn. "I didn't do it for him," she said. "I mean, not only, I did it because it was mine too." "I know," Louis said. "That's what I mean." She held his gaze for a moment that lasted longer than either of them planned for, and then Pearl shifted and bumped her shoulder and she looked back at the mare, and the moment released. But not entirely. Some part of it stayed. The storm passed by midnight, leaving the world washed and glittering and rearranged. Louis helped Catherine check the property by lantern light. The chicken coop held, the barn was intact, the garden had taken some damage but not fatal damage, the cattle were fine. He stayed until they were sure everything was in order, and then he rode back to town on August under a sky that had cleared to extraordinary stars. The kind that only appear after a storm has blown the air entirely clean. He got back to Ma Epler's at 2 in the morning and lay on his bed in his clothes for a while, looking at the ceiling, and let himself think about Catherine Hawthorne's face in the lantern light of the barn, the way the silver came into her eyes when she was moved by something. He let himself think about it without qualification or caution, just thought about it plainly, the way you think about something when you have stopped trying to talk yourself out of it. He was in love with her. He had been in some version of it since the wagon wheel, since the 3 seconds on Main Street. Since the first moment he had seen her holding those reins with a burned hand and making it look effortless. The love had grown in the weeks since with the quiet insistence of something that intends to persist regardless of whether it receives encouragement, and he was done pretending that the arithmetic added up to anything other than what it was. The question was what he was going to do about it. Lewis Warren was not a man who acted without thinking, but he was also not a man who thought so long that thinking became a substitute for doing. He had a strong sense of Catherine's pace, of the careful and deliberate way she moved toward things that mattered to her, and he understood that the correct approach here was not to arrive with declarations. The correct approach was to continue being present and honest, and let her come to what she was ready to come to in the time it took her. He could wait. He was good at waiting. June moved through its days with the warm competence of a good Kansas summer, which was the kind that balanced heat with enough rain and enough breeze to make the grass grow deep, and the cattle fat, and the kitchen gardens productive in a way that reminded you why people had come out here in the first place. Catherine's 6 cattle were on the creek grass with Dodd's herd for summer grazing, supervised by Dodd's men, which freed her from the daily circuit of the south pasture and gave her time she had not had in months. She used it to fix the east barn wall that she had been meaning to fix since February. She used it to extend the kitchen garden into a section she had left fallow. She used it to repair the roof over the back porch where the winter had pushed a gap between 2 of the boards, and when she got up there with the hammer and the nails, she could see all 40 acres from above, the creek flashing silver in the morning light, the garden green and ordered, the fence lines tight on 3 sides, and she felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel, something close to satisfaction. She also used some of it to talk to Lewis Warren. They had fallen into a pattern that was not formalized but was consistent. He rode past the property on his way back from the Dodd operation most evenings, and more often than not he stopped, and they sat on the fence at the south edge or the porch steps and talked as the light went. Sometimes they talked about the practical things, the upcoming cattle sale, the garden yield, the territory news. Sometimes they talked about other things. She asked him why he had never claimed land for himself. He had been in Kansas 7 years, working the trail, and a man with 7 years of trail wages could have gotten himself set up with something. He was quiet for a moment before answering. "I didn't know what I was looking for," he said. "I knew I wanted something of my own, but I couldn't see the shape of it." "Can you see it now?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "More clearly than I could a few months ago," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked out at the creek, and there was a softness in her face that was different from the softness he had begun to see in recent weeks, more deliberate, less involuntary, as if she were choosing to let him see it. "The Minter payment comes next week," she said. "That covers the July mortgage with room to spare." "And the August sale," he said. "I'm going to wait, as you suggested," she said, "for the price." "It'll hold," he said. She turned to look at him fully. "Lewis," she said, and she stopped. He waited. "I haven't been easy to know," she said. "I'm aware of that. I don't ask for things easily, and I don't let people in easily, and I've been told more than once that I am formidable in a way that is not always a compliment." She was speaking carefully, each word chosen and meant. "I want you to know that I am aware that you have been patient with me. I am aware that you have been," she paused, "more than kind. And I don't quite know what to do with that, but I wanted you to know that I know it." He was very still. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "I think I might want to," she said. "I think I might want to." She was looking at him with those clear gray eyes, the silver in them, the full direct attention that was Catherine Hawthorne's particular way of being present, and Lewis Warren looked back at her and felt the coal in his chest go from warmth to a heat that was neither comfortable nor entirely uncomfortable but was completely alive. "I'd like to call on you," he said, "properly, if you're amenable." "I believe I am," she said. And the real smile arrived again, the full one, and this time it lasted. The courtship that followed was not rushed, because neither of them were rushing people. Lewis called on Catherine twice a week, on Thursday evenings and Sunday afternoons, which were the times her work allowed for it, and the times his allowed as well. He brought no extravagant gifts. He was not a man of extravagant gestures, and she was not a woman who would have known what to do with them. But he brought a sack of good coffee from the specialty merchant in Wichita who sold it by the pound, and whose product was considerably better than what Harold Beam stocked, because he had noticed that she drank a great deal of coffee, and that the quality of it mattered to her in the small way that small pleasures matter to people who have very few of them. She received the coffee with the dignity of a woman who knows exactly what it means and says thank you with her eyes more than her words. He read to her on Sunday evenings, because she mentioned once that she had a shelf of books she had brought from the East and had not had time to open in over a year, and reading was the thing she missed most, and he had a good reading voice, a low and even voice without dramatics, and she could sit and listen to it while she did her mending, and the evenings went golden and then dark around them, and the sound of the planes came in through the open windows. He was, she realized, the most comfortable person she had been in a room with since Robert died. Not comfortable in the sense of familiar or unchallenging. Lewis Warren was, in his quiet way, consistently challenging, because he thought about things seriously and said what he thought and expected the same from her. But comfortable in the sense of easy, of being herself without editing or performance, of not having to be fine if she was not fine, and not having to be stoic if something was painful. She told him this one Thursday evening, sitting on the porch in the warm June dark, and he looked at her for a moment and then said, "You can be whatever you actually are. I'm not interested in anything else." It was, she thought, possibly the most important thing anyone had said to her in years. Dale Prout came back in the second week of June, as she had expected he would. He arrived on a Thursday morning with an updated offer and a manner that had become slightly less smooth, which she recognized as a sign that his timetable was becoming inconvenient. The offer was better than the first 70% of assessed value, and he presented it with a detailed accounting of the ways in which the coming summer, despite its apparent promise, carried risks she might not be positioned to survive. Catherine listened to him with complete attention and said, "Mr. Prout, the Dodd operation and the Minter brothers have contracted for summer grazing and water rights on this property. The August mortgage will be paid in full from the sale of 6 head at summer peak prices. The land is not for sale." Prout blinked. Something moved behind his eyes, not admiration exactly, but the recalibration of a man who has just discovered that the vulnerability he was counting on has been significantly reduced. "I see," he said. "Good day, Mr. Prout," she said. He tipped his hat and left, and this time Catherine knew with a reasonable certainty that he would not be back. She told Lewis that evening. She told it plainly as a victory, not a large one, not the end of anything, but a solid, real victory that she had earned. And Lewis listened and then said, "Good," with a simple completeness that was exactly right. She kissed him that night for the first time. They were standing at the porch steps at the end of the evening, and he was putting his hat on to leave. And she stepped forward and put her hand against his jaw and kissed him very deliberately, because she was a deliberate person, and this was deliberate. Lewis went still for a fraction of a second, and then he kissed her back with a gentleness that was also deliberate, his hands careful and respectful, and when they parted, his pale blue eyes were the warmest she had ever seen them. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she said. He rode back to town on August with the June night spread across the prairie like a black silk cloth full of stars, and he thought about nothing specific at all, Just let himself feel the horse moving under him and the night air and the fact of what had just happened, and it was the finest kind of thinking, the thinking that is really just being. The summer continued. The cattle grew fat on the creek grass. The kitchen garden produced a bounty that Catherine preserved in every jar she owned, lining the pantry shelves in ordered rows of summer color. The August cattle sale came, and the prices were exactly what Lewis had predicted, in fact, slightly better, and she sold all 6 head and cleared not only the August mortgage but a substantial portion of what remained on the balance, which meant that the debt that had been pressing on her like a stone for over a year was now, for the first time, in a range she could see across. Lewis had stopped working for Clarence Dodd. He had given Dodd notice at the end of July, with proper respect and adequate warning, and Dodd had taken it in the manner of a fair man who understood that the arrangement had always been temporary. Lewis had gone to see Thomas Minter, the older of the Minter brothers, and had a conversation about a different kind of arrangement, a partnership in the operation of a small cattle venture, using the Hawthorne Creek access as a base, a venture that Lewis would run and Minter would partially finance in exchange for a percentage of the profits, and the right of first purchase on any cattle Lewis did not sell himself. He had then gone to Arthur Finch at the Caldwell Savings and Loan and asked about the terms for a land claim adjacent to the Hawthorne parcel, 10 acres to the north, which had been sitting vacant since its previous owner had moved on 2 years ago. He was making a plan. He was, for the first time since he had left Missouri 7 years ago, making a plan that had a place in it rather than a road. He told Catherine about it on a Thursday evening, sitting at her kitchen table with the coffee she had made from the good Wichita stock, and he was careful in the telling, careful not to make it sound like he was assuming anything about her role in the plan, because her land was her land and her decisions were her decisions, and he had no interest in appropriating either. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "You're putting down roots." "I think so," he said. "Here," she said, not a question. "Here," he said. He held her gaze. "Near you, if that's agreeable." She was quiet for a moment that he let her have entirely without filling it. Then she said, "Lewis Warren, I think you are the most carefully thoughtful man I have ever known." "Is that good?" he said. "Yes," she said. "That's very good." In August, he bought the 10 acres. He began building a small house on the north end of it, not large but solid, the kind of construction that was meant to last, the kind that showed its intentions in every squared corner and secure roof beam. He built it in his off hours, with help on the weekends from 2 men at the Dodd operation who owed him various small favors and were willing to work for meals, which Catherine provided with the efficiency and generosity she brought to everything she was willing to be generous with. She brought him water when he was working in the heat. She brought it matter-of-factly, without ceremony, just walked across the fence line that divided their properties and set the pail down within reach and went back to her own work. The first time she did it, Lewis watched her go and felt something expand in his chest that had no name in particular except rightness. He asked her to marry him in September. The summer heat had broken and the plains were going to gold, and the mornings had that sharp clarity that only comes to Kansas in early autumn, when the sky is so blue it is almost aggressive, and the light has an angle that makes everything look simultaneously finished and just beginning. He asked her on a Sunday afternoon, and they were walking along the creek on the south edge of her property as they sometimes did, and he stopped walking and turned to face her and said, "Catherine, I want to marry you." No framing, no extensive preamble, no elaborate staging, just the direct and honest statement of what he wanted. She looked at him for a long moment, and he let her look, because she deserved to take whatever time she needed. "I want that too," she said. "I've wanted it for longer than I've been able to admit." He took her hand, the right one, the one that had been wrapped in a piece of petticoat the day he first saw her, the one he had carried the image of for months, and held it carefully, feeling the roughness of her palm, the competence built into its texture, and she looked down at their joined hands and then up at his face. "I love you," he said, It was the first time he had said it. He meant it with his whole chest. "I love you," she said. It was the first time she had said it. She meant it in a way that had been building since the fence post on the East Road, since the barn in the storm, since the evenings of books and coffee, and the plain, quiet truth of being known. He kissed her there on the creek bank, with the cottonwoods going yellow above them and the water running clear over the rocks, and it was the kind of kiss that is an arrival and a beginning simultaneously. They were married in October, on a Saturday, in the small Methodist church on the north end of Caldwell's Main Street. The ceremony was modest, neither of them wanted elaborate, but it was attended by a respectable number of the townspeople, because in the months of their courtship, Catherine Hawthorne, who had always been respected from a careful distance, had become something more accessible, not less herself but more open to being known, and people had found her, to their various surprises, to be someone they wanted to know. Harold Beam was there with his wife. Hector Morales was there. Thomas Minter made the ride from his operation and brought his wife, a compact, cheerful woman named Rachel who took to Catherine immediately. Even Clarence Dodd came, and stood in the back with his hat in his hands, and looked moved in the particular embarrassed way of men who feel things deeply and prefer not to be known for it. Catherine wore her best dress, which was a deep blue that the October light turned to something approaching silk, and she walked to the front of that small church with the straight-backed, lifted chin bearing that was entirely herself. But the gray eyes were not steel-colored on that day. They were the silvery, warm color of rain coming through light. And when she reached Louis at the front of the church and he turned to look at her, she saw in his pale blue eyes everything she needed to know about what she was walking toward. They said their vows simply and clearly, looking at each other, meaning every word. After the wedding, the guests gathered at the Hawthorne property, Catherine's property, which by the terms they had quietly worked out was to remain in her name as well as his, because she had earned it, and Louis insisted on that with a firmness that left no room for argument. And there was food and music. A fiddle played by a man who worked for Minter, and had a talent that was generally considered borderline miraculous, and people danced on the flat ground south of the house as the October sun went down. Louis danced with Catherine, which he did badly and cheerfully, holding her hand and her waist and navigating the steps with the focused attention of a man applying serious labor to something he is determined to learn. And she laughed at him, fully and genuinely, and he laughed too, and the sound of it went up over the Kansas prairie and dispersed into the enormous sky. Hector Morales, watching from the side with a cup of cider, said to Harold Beam, "I always thought those two would find their way." Harold Beam, who was a practical man, said, "Took them a while." "Good things take a while," Hector said. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was kinder than the winter that had taken Robert, which Catherine understood to have no particular meaning, but allowed herself to be grateful for anyway. She and Louis settled into the combined operations of the two properties, her 40 acres and his 10, with a partnership that was natural and equal, and built on the deeply practical foundation of mutual respect that had been its beginning. Louis was a different kind of man from Robert, which she thought about sometimes and made her peace with completely. Robert had been vision and warmth and the belief that things would work out. Louis was attention and patience and the quiet, steady insistence of a man who shows up every day and does what needs doing. She loved both things, and she had had both things at different times in her life, and she was grateful for the particularity of each. Louis was aware, in his thoughtful way, that he was the second man she had loved, and he did not ask her to minimize the first. He was also, she had come to understand, a man who had been waiting for something specific for a long time, and had found it, and intended to keep it. There was no taking anything for granted in Louis Warren. Every morning he woke up in the house they were building together, and went about the work of their life with the purposefulness of someone who knows the value of what he has, and has no intention of wasting a day of it. He was, Catherine thought often, the right person at the right time, which was perhaps the truest thing that could be said about love between two grown people who have already learned the shape of loss. In the spring of 1879, they planted the kitchen garden together for the first time, which was a small thing, but the kind of small thing that adds up to a life. Lewis had strong opinions about the optimal spacing of bean rows, which turned out to be incorrect, and Catherine corrected him with a direct and not entirely kind efficiency, and he listened to the correction with complete good humor and adjusted his spacing accordingly. And this exchange, the correction, the response was in many ways the most accurate portrait of their marriage, which was honest and equal and fully capable of holding disagreement without requiring either person to diminish. The Minter partnership was going well. Lewis had built the cattle operation up to 15 head by the following spring, using the creek access and the Minter investment and his own considerable knowledge of what cattle needed and what the market would bear. The mortgage on the original 40 acres was fully paid off by November of 1879. Catherine stood in the Caldwell savings and loan and made the final payment and watched Arthur Finch recorded in his ledger, and felt a satisfaction that was so complete and so quiet that it needed no outward expression at all. She simply walked out of the bank onto the boardwalk and stood in the November sunlight for a moment, and then she went and found Lewis at the livery where he was talking to Hector about a new wagon, a good one, solid with no compromise spokes in the wheels, which Lewis had insisted on and was paying for with the autumn cattle profits, and she walked up to him and said, "It's done." He looked at her and he understood exactly what she meant. He put his arm around her shoulders, which was not something he did frequently in public, but which felt right in that moment. And she let herself lean into him, just briefly, the particular lean of someone who is not accustomed to leaning, but has decided that this one person and this one moment are both worthy of the exception. In the late winter of that same year, Catherine told Lewis she was expecting. She told him in the morning, before the day had properly started, standing in the kitchen with the stove fire going and the coffee on, and she said it plainly because she said everything plainly, and Lewis was quiet for a moment that was not an uncertain moment but a receiving moment, a moment of letting something large land in you properly before you respond to it. Then he said, "Are you well?" "Entirely," she said. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her forehead, and his hands on her shoulders were careful and warm. "Good," he said. His voice had a quality she had never heard in it before, a depth of feeling that was deeper than his usual depth, which was already considerable. "You're going to be extremely attentive about this," she said. "Yes," he said with no apology. "I'm not fragile," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll be attentive anyway." She gave him a long look and decided not to argue because she had been alone for too long not to know the value of someone who wanted to be attentive, and because she was, although she would sooner have been caught floating 6 inches off the ground than admitted it openly, touched. Their son was born in the October of 1880, on a clear autumn morning when the cottonwoods along the creek were going yellow, and the sky had that aggressive blue quality that October brought to Kansas. He was a healthy, loud, definite sort of baby who arrived in the world with opinions and expressed them without hesitation. They named him Robert James Warren Robert for the man who had come to this land first, with his good dreams and his good heart, James for Lewis's father in Missouri. Lewis held his son for the first time on the morning of his arrival, sitting in the chair beside Catherine's bed, while she slept with the absolute completeness of a person who has done something enormous, and he looked at the small face of this new person, who was somehow constructed of the two of them, and of things that neither of them had contributed individually, and he felt a love that was different from everything he had felt before, wider and less defensible. Completely, without the caution that he had always brought to feeling things strongly. He sat there for a long time, Robert James asleep against his chest, and thought about Catherine driving her wagon into Caldwell on a spring morning in 1878 with a burned hand and a cracked wheel spoke, and the magnificent, absolute refusal to admit that things were hard, And he thought about how all of that, the wheel, the hand, the fence, the creek, the August sail, the porch, the storm, all of it, had led in its quiet way to this morning in this room with this sleeping child and the sound of this woman breathing in the bed beside him. He had always been good at noticing things. He had never been more grateful for it than now. When Catherine woke, she turned immediately to look at Louis, checking the way she always checked, and found him there with his pale blue eyes on her and the baby asleep in his arms. And she put her hand out across the blanket and he took it. And they stayed like that for a while, the new morning coming in through the window, the creek running at the south edge of the 40 acres, the kitchen garden already put to bed for the winter, the cattle safe in the barn, the house solid and warm around them. "He looks like you," Louis said. "He's extremely loud," Catherine said. "He does not get that from me." "He gets it from wanting things," Louis said. "He gets that from you." She looked at their son and then at Louis and felt the full, complete, undefended weight of what her life had become. Not what it had been designed to be, not what she had planned or expected or allowed herself to want, but what it had turned out to be, which was something she could not have invented, and which was built of ordinary materials, flour and fence wire and creek water and good coffee, and the specific irreplaceable quality of being truly known. "Louis," she said. "Yes," he said. "I was struggling," she said. "When you first saw me, I was really struggling." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "I never said it, not to you, not to anyone." She paused, "But you knew." "Yes," he said. "And you didn't make me say it," she said. "No," he said. She held his gaze and he held hers, and between them everything that had been since the beginning was present and accounted for the wagon wheel and the stone in Pearl's hoof and the grazing rights and the storm in the barn and every Thursday evening and every Sunday afternoon and the creek bank in September and the October wedding and every morning since in this house on this land. "Thank you," she said. It was the same thank you she had said on the road that first day, plain and genuine and exactly meant. But it was not the same thank you. It was larger and carried more. "Thank you," he said back. Because she had let him in, which was the harder thing, and he knew it. Robert James Warren woke up and expressed his opinions loudly, and Louis got up to manage this with the competence he brought to everything, and Catherine lay back against her pillow and listened to her husband talk to their son in the low, easy Missouri voice that she had loved since she first heard it in a room full of strangers at a town gathering in the spring of 1878, and she let herself feel the full breadth of it, the land, the life, the love, the child, the future that was already unfolding beyond the window into the wide October Kansas morning. She was not struggling anymore. Or rather, she was doing the ordinary hard work of living, which is its own kind of struggle, and she would go on doing it because that was who she was and would always be. But she was not alone in it. She had not been alone in it for a long time, and she knew now, in the particular sure way of something fully understood and freely chosen, that she would not be alone in it again. The years that followed were not without difficulty years on the Kansas plains, never were. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the ordinary griefs of a life lived fully and close to the land. Thomas Minter's operation expanded and contracted with the cattle market, and Louis navigated those changes with the same steady attention he brought to everything. The town of Caldwell grew and changed, the cattle trade shifting as the railroads pushed further west and the routes and rhythms of the great drives evolved. Louis adapted. He always adapted, because adaptation was a form of attention and attention was what he did. Their second child was a daughter, born in the spring of 1882, with Catherine's gray eyes and Louis's Missouri stubbornness, which made her a force of nature from approximately the age of 14 months. They named her Clara, and Robert, who was by then a solid and cheerful boy of 2, regarded his sister with the deep suspicion of a firstborn confronted by competition, and eventually, over a period of several months, came to an accommodation with her existence, and then to an actual affection that was occasionally expressed in the form of dragging her away from hazards she had identified as interesting. Catherine taught in the Caldwell School for 3 years beginning in 1883, because the school needed someone who could teach arithmetic and basic science, and the regular teacher had left for better climate. And Catherine's capability in both subjects was known, and she did it because it was useful, and because she discovered, to her own surprise, that she was very good at it. The children of Caldwell's various families were not especially afraid of her, which was unusual, and she found that she liked them better than expected. Lewis built a proper study room onto the side of the house for her teacher's preparation work, framing it in himself over 2 autumn weekends, and she came out one afternoon to find the walls up and the roof on and the window frame installed. And she stood looking at it for a moment, and then went to where he was sawing boards and kissed him on the cheek with such sudden warmth that he dropped the saw, which they both considered very funny. Robert James Warren grew into a boy who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was a better combination than either of them had any right to expect. By the time he was 8, he could read the signs of weather on the Kansas plains with an accuracy that impressed even Lewis, who had been doing it for 20 years. He was, in the plain, happy way of children who are loved well and consistently, a contented child, and the contentment showed in everything he did. Clara Warren was, to the surprise of no one who had met her parents, formidable. She was the one who would stand at the fence of the pasture and argue with the cattle about where they should be going, and win, because she had a will of absolute iron that she had obtained from sources that both her parents acknowledged and neither of them would formally claim. She was also, underneath the iron, tender in the specific way of people whose tenderness is real precisely, because it is not automatically on display. The land, the original 40 acres, and the 10 that Lewis had claimed, and the additional 15 they had acquired in 1884 when the parcel to the east came available at a price that made sense, was working well. The cattle operation was modest but steady, and the creek access continued to be their best asset, as it had always been. They had invested in a second horse, a good working gelding named Patience, who had earned his name by surviving his first 2 years in the company of August and Pearl, both of whom had opinions about the gelding's proper place in the hierarchy. Lewis and Catherine grew older together in the way that people grow older when they have chosen rightly, with the accumulation of shared knowledge and shared history, and the deepening of the particular familiarity that is only built by time and the willingness to be consistently, genuinely present. He still noticed things. He always noticed things. He noticed when she was tired before she would admit it, and made sure the supper was on the table when he could arrange it. He noticed when something was bothering her in the considered, interior way things bothered Catherine, the slight tightening at the edge of the eyes, the very small increase in the precision of her movements that happened when she was working something difficult through, and he gave her the space to work it through, and was there when she came out the other side. She noticed things about him too. She had become very good at it, better than almost anyone knew, because noticing was something she did quietly, the way she did most things. She noticed when the trail ache in his left shoulder was bad, an old injury from a fall in his 3rd year on the Kishom, and adjusted the work schedule on those days with a casualness that made it seem like circumstance rather than care, because Lewis, it turned out, had his own pride, and she had learned to work with it the way he had always worked with hers. They were, in the plainest and truest sense, partners. Equal, practical, deeply in love in the way that love becomes when it has been tested by time and reality, and has persisted through both. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, in October of 1888, they walked along the creek at the south edge of the property, as they had walked many evenings over the 10 years, with Robert James somewhere behind them doing something purposeful and Clara some distance ahead doing something loud. The cottonwoods were going yellow again, as they always did in October, and the creek ran clear and steady over its stones, as it had always done, as it would go on doing. Lewis stopped walking, as he had stopped once before on this same ground, and turned to look at her. Catherine Hawthorne, Catherine Warren, looked back at him with the gray eyes that were, in the late afternoon light, exactly the silver color he had been keeping in his memory since the evening they had sat in the storm-lit barn, and she had told him about the winter she lost Robert and the spring she had promised him, and she smiled at him with the full, real smile. The one she had given him since that May morning when Minter had agreed and she had turned to him in front of the Dodd operation and let herself be glad without reservation. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he said. I was thinking, she said carefully, in the way she said things she meant with precision, about the morning you fixed my wagon wheel, that you had it done without telling me. He looked at her. After 10 years, he had told her the full story of the early weeks, the fence, the beef order, all of it. She had taken the information with the particular equanimity of a woman who has had time to prepare for it, and had made a decision in advance about how she was going to feel. I was thinking, she continued, that you saw me before I had any idea you were looking. Yes, he said. And you said nothing and just helped, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and the cottonwoods moved in the October wind above the creek, and Clara shouted something distant and cheerful behind them, and the cattle moved in the south pasture with their low, contented sound. That was the right thing, she said. It was exactly the right thing. He reached out and took her hand, the right one, always the right one, and she gave it to him. I know, he said. I knew you. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did now without any of the deliberateness it had once required. Just naturally, the way you lean against something you have tested 10,000 times and found completely reliable. They stood there together at the south edge of the 40 acres that was hers and his and theirs, the creek running in the yellow October light, and it was the life she had not planned and could not have imagined and would not have traded for any other version of any other thing. The Kansas plains stretched out beyond them in every direction, enormous and clear and indifferent in the way the land is always indifferent, holding no particular opinion about the smallness of any human story. But inside that smallness, inside the fence lines, and the kitchen garden and the barn and the creek, and the house with the study room framed on in an autumn weekend, was everything that mattered. A woman who had been too proud to say she was struggling. A man who had seen it before she could hide it and said nothing and just helped. And from that quiet beginning, everything else. They walked back toward the house together, hand in hand, as the October evening came down across the Kansas plains with its particular cold beauty, and the lights in the windows ahead were warm and specific and entirely theirs, and the sound of their children and the cattle and the familiar creak of the porch steps under Lewis's boots, and the smell of the supper that Clara had started, because she was old enough now to manage it, and like the authority it gave her, all of it rose up around them as they came home. And they were home, and it was good, and it was enough, and it was whole.